Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this afternoon's session, Turning the Tide, Harnessing Partnerships Against Modern-Day Slavery, moderated by Ambassador Louis CdeBaca and our principals for the session.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this great big round. I'm not sure if there's a round table or if it's a ramp. So if anybody starts skateboarding halfway through, we know that this thing will take a skateboard. So today's conversation is actually part of an ongoing conversation hosted by Concordia as part of its campaign against labor trafficking with Winrock and the NYU Stern School. And we want to thank both Winrock and the Stern School for being such an integral part of this. This is this year's iteration of that conversation. Clearly, it's a conversation that goes on throughout the years as well. And it, in so many ways, is a conversation that is reflecting the good work that y'all are doing out in the field. We've got 29 principles, 2 hours to tee up 3 questions, which have a lot of subparts. So I'm going to caution everyone to be brief. For me to say that is, I know, a little ironic. But just a couple of housekeeping notes on how we're going to do this today. I'm going to kick things off, and then we'll turn to Cyrus Vance, who's the district attorney here in Manhattan, to frame the importance of tools to confront labor trafficking. The focus today being very much about labor trafficking, but as we know, even in labor trafficking, there's a lot of sexual abuse, sexual harassment, et cetera. And so I'm not going to be gaveling out any comments that address sex trafficking. Mike Posner from NYU Stern's Center for Business and Human Rights, a former colleague at the State Department, and it's great to be at a table with him again, will also give us some thoughts on collaboration and partnerships to make those tools a reality. And then we'll have 3 main discussion topics with about 35 minutes or so per theme. Now, this is a discussion-oriented session, and so its success is going to depend on folks pitching in. So interjections are certainly encouraged. Filibustering and advertisements are not. But we need to pretty much try to limit ourselves to constructive comments or thought-provoking questions. If you have something that you want to highlight in the projects that you're doing, certainly that's welcome. But please, if it could contribute to the conversation topics or be something that requires or welcomes participation from the others around the table. To the degree that there are projects that we can announce and tee up as a collaboration, an invitation to take this out of the room in that sense of partnership, then I think that would be optimal. We will end on time. Principals and audience are welcome to continue the dialogue in the lounge afterwards with the understanding and caveat that many of us will be rushing over to the 46th and 2nd Avenue entrance to the United Nations so that we can get into the launch of the global estimates, which for the first time is the result of collaboration. And I want to thank Jen on behalf of Walk Free. You're in the chair today, so thank you to you and all of your partners for the great work throughout the years on the Global Index, but also coming together with ILO. I know Hutan's here and a number of other folks later we'll see this afternoon as those new numbers come out. It's great to see that as a collaborative partnership between 2 of the most accomplished folks that have been in this space as far as data collection. So with that in mind, and again, the threat that we're going to get out of here promptly at 3:40, I'm going to turn over to the District Attorney, Mr. Vance.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ambassador. Good afternoon, everybody. I was thrilled, really, to be asked to participate briefly in this meeting because I've looked at everyone's bios, some I know, but this is a group that is incredibly dedicated and I think hugely important for what is, I think, must be an international effort to identify and stop trafficking in all its forms. I am the Manhattan District Attorney, meaning that I am the law enforcement official, prosecutor here in Manhattan. And I think we bear sort of a special responsibility when we're talking about labor trafficking coming from New York City, because indeed we are the market for the commodities which are sold, which may have trafficked individuals in the supply chain. And much as we focus on eliminating sale of ivory, For example, in our marketplace here, I don't know the answer yet, but I know that our office has to play a role and hopefully will be a leader, not just in fighting sex trafficking, which we've done now for many years, and thanks to my staff who are here very successfully, but increasingly in the area of labor trafficking. From my perspective, the challenge as the district attorney, but the challenge that I see as I travel around is raising awareness. All of you, I'm sure, are very well known in your spheres, but I think the issue of labor trafficking is one that is not widely known in the country. So the ability of Concordia and you in your voices to raise the level of awareness that this is a problem whose numbers may dwarf those even of sex trafficking, that we need to all be mindful of it and take it into consideration as we move forward in our businesses and with our organizations. What I'd like to talk about just in my 5 minutes is 2 or 3 issues. One is technology, which Lou talked about. In a prosecutor's office, in some sense, we don't have some of the technology that private industry has. In some sense, we have better technology. But what has been instrumental in our fighting sex trafficking in our office is technology that we started using from DARPA about 4 years ago called Memex. And what Memex is, and I'm not super sophisticated on it, but essentially much of the communication, much of the advertising in the sex trafficking world is conducted on the web, but in locations where the ordinary person can't attack them or find them. And Memex is a tool that was designed by the federal government and which our office is using, as I say, and will continue to use, enabling us to do deep web searches, to organize that which we find in the web in a way which we can pull out and help in our investigations. And sex trafficking, for example, one of its most useful functions is that individuals often will put a picture on the web and then a phone number, for example, who to call if you want to engage in trafficking with this individual. And that phone number is previously impossible to find. But when you're trying to find a database to build a case and you're looking for where those phone numbers exist, and it enables you as one factor in linking criminals together. So technology is playing a significant role, and I'm sure that that's the case for all of us. But we plan to use Memex, having used it successfully in sex trafficking. We plan to modify it so that we're able to use it in labor trafficking. And that's when we really turn to the issue of collaboration. I will say one of the real educations that I've received as district attorney is how absolutely critical it is that government work in collaboration with the not-for-profit world as well as private business. In private business, you are really the ones who have the data. The companies and others represented around here, I'm sure you're involved in examining your supply chain through your certification process and otherwise. You know what you're seeing. The question is, are you in a position that you are willing to and then do effectively share it with government officials that can perhaps take your information and build it into a larger case if criminal investigation and prosecution is warranted. And I see this collaboration really in ways that are directly related to this and other kinds of areas. So Monique Villa, who you all know from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, that foundation has done a great job, just as for example, of bringing banks and our office in to work on identifying the factors, the red flags that we should be looking for in sex trafficking, and then working with private industry to make sure that they incorporate that in their business model. We also do this in cybercrime, and there are some similarities. One of the biggest problems of cybercrime, again, is raising awareness. But one of the most important things I think we've done as the office has nothing to do with prosecution, which we will do forever. It is a not-for-profit we created with the British City of London Police, where we are focusing on cyber prevention, because I believe that if we can prevent cybercrime, it's going to be a much more effective way to deal with cybercrime than it is by prosecuting individual actors. So it's in the prevention space also that I think you can have and we can have impact that we perhaps have not considered. Yes, catching a labor trafficker is important, but if you're in your businesses and your government institutions, you are finding prevention strategies, you're going to affect many more people. You'd much rather prevent that person from being trafficked than prosecute the trafficker. It's common sense, but government often, and prosecutors particularly, don't often think about what's the real goal here. The real goal is to reduce crime. And what's the most crime we can reduce, and how do we do it? And that's how our office is now thinking about it, but it requires collaboration. In the cyber case, we have about 175 companies and governments participating now in a worldwide effort pushing technology out to elevate the barriers in corporations from folks getting in to contaminate the corporation. So we've talked about technology, we've talked about collaboration, and I'd like to end just on the role of government in the area of certification. Now, we know the federal government has certification practices when it comes to sex and labor trafficking. And our office, for example, is now being educated by outside counsel on how we can develop a certification process so that before we are buying materials, that we are able to ensure the public that those are not materials where in the supply chain labor trafficking or other trafficking has occurred. And when you multiply my state office by 3,200 prosecutors' offices around the country, or county executives, I think we all see that government is a huge purchaser. I think government stands united behind the concept of elimination of sex trafficking and human trafficking and labor trafficking, and government needs to stand together, federal and state, and together we will have a huge impact. And along with the partnerships of the NGOs and business around this table, we can do amazing work. Nothing is impossible. The impossible just takes longer. So thank you so much for including me.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn it over now to Mike Posner from NYU, and to thank Mike on a lot of our behalfs for the work that you've been doing on this for quite a bit of time. You've taught me a lot, and I just want to say thanks for that.
Well, thank you, Lou, and delighted to be here, delighted to see you. And also I want to say thanks to Concordia and also Winrock, our other partner in this, for organizing this meeting. Concordia does such a good job in forging partnerships and really pushing both business, government, and civil society to think about positive social impact. So last year we had a discussion like this that was very much focused on the fishing industry. And one of the things I think that came out of that meeting was a clear sense that when we talk about sustainability, we need to be going beyond looking just at the environmental sustainability issues, but also integrate discussions of labor and human rights. And so I very much hope that those issues are, again, at least somewhat on the table here. I wanted to take just my few minutes to give a couple of maybe provocative comments about the three sub-themes of this meeting. The first is called good intention. When good intentions go awry, I think that's too negative a frame. I would say, how do we ensure that good intentions yield improved performance and better outcomes? And one of the things that I think is very important in that regard, District Attorney Vance just talked about certification requirements. I think actually the more important piece here is to develop standards for each industry, metrics that go along with those standards, and then an ongoing means of assessment and accountability. So certification may be a piece of that, but the really important thing is to have a sustained way of every company in an industry looking at the same things, having the same metrics. I'm now, as the last couple of months, chairing something called the Fair Labor Association, which I was involved in the 90s in helping to set up. It's about 60 big global companies in the apparel industry and in the in agriculture. We have 9 standards on things like forced labor, child labor, et cetera. We have several hundred metrics that have been developed over 20 years, and the companies go through an accreditation process where throughout the year they're being evaluated. We need to be looking at every industry and saying, how do we replicate that example? The second item, which several of you are going to talk about, is data collection. We did a look at about a dozen means of evaluating social in the ESG. You have environmental, social, and governance. We called our report Putting the S in ESG, because our sense is that there has not been enough attention to really evaluating social, labor, human rights performance. My colleague Casey O'Connor-Willett, who wrote the report, looked at 1,700 metrics for social. Less than 8% of them, less than 1,700 metrics for ESG. Less than 8% looked at social at all. And only a handful really looked at performance as opposed to what companies are promising and what they're reporting. And so our sense of this, several conclusions: we need clear standards again for each industry, what the metrics are. That which is measured improves. We need to diversify data and go beyond what companies are themselves providing. And we need to make investors a target. Investors right now are swimming in lots of data, but they don't have ways of evaluating companies one to another. So I hope there's some discussion of that. Last, third category, and I will stop. The third category is how do we enlist corporate might? Monique Villa hosted a program at Davos in January where she brought a couple of leading companies, Hewlett-Packard and Unilever. We need to look for the best practices for the best companies, reinforce them and give them credit. I also will call out what Irit, Tamir, and Oxfam are doing with Behind the Brands. They're engaging, they're encouraging companies, but they're also holding them accountable, those 10 food and beverage companies. And I'm sure Irit won't be shy in talking about that. We have now the added tools of reporting, the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, Dodd-Frank with conflict minerals. We've got to build on those reporting techniques and make them stronger. But the third and last piece, we've got a number of government people around the table. Government is the biggest consumer of almost everything. We need to look at government procurement policies. And it may not happen in this administration or even in the next 10 years, but we got to lay the predicate for that. When the government starts to say, these are things we will demand as a customer, then we're going to see real changes. That will be a real partnership between government, industry, and the public sector. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. And in the spirit of provocative questions, I'm going to start us off as far as what are meaningful certifications. We're going to go straight into certifications instead of building up to it. But I think that we have to ask the ultimate question then first, which is certification helpful? Is certification a fig leaf? Is certification greenwashing? Are we years out from having a meaningful certification, or is there some type of certification that would respond to the needs of the business community? And I'm going to actually, without having warned her that I was going to do this, I'm going to ask our friends from Mars to kind of walk us through how you look at the different sectors, because you are in different sectors that have different processes, whether it's cocoa, whether it's fish, whether it's palm oil, et cetera. There's a lot of different inputs that you guys are dealing with. And there are a number of folks out there who have suggested that they would be able to certify for you. Is that enough?
Great, thank you, Lou. Great to be part of this conversation. My name is Marika Immokalee. I'm responsible for human rights at Mars Incorporated. Really a pleasure to be here. Just to frame up briefly and then answer your question, building on the points that were made around collective action. So the Consumer Goods Forum is an organization of 400 of the world's biggest consumer goods companies. And recently, the Consumer Goods Forum issued a resolution laying out a firm belief that forced labor in global supply chains is unacceptable, and we need to work toward addressing it. Then back that up with an articulation of what the forum sees as the 3 most common manifestations of forced labor in the private sector and in the global economy. And what we've found is that this simplicity and this focus has really driven action. As you say, there are hundreds of indicators that one can look at, but when you boil forced labor and modern slavery down to the core practices that are most commonly manifested, it gives us something to work with. You know, many businesses have had in their codes for many years, no forced labor, and yet we see this issue persisting. So what do we need to do differently? So part of our thinking is let's really call out freedom of movement, freedom from coercion and indebtedness, not having to pay to get a job as the priorities, and let's focus our efforts there and see if we can make progress. So I think that's powerful. Hopefully it will bear fruit, and it's early in the journey, but there are already quite promising indications from the fish industry, for example, in Southeast Asia, from the palm oil industry and other industries where this focus is working. The electronics industry has already been quite far down the path, so that's promising. When it comes to certification, clearly certifications all say no forced labor, and yet this issue continues to be a challenge. I think the conversation now is about how do we not walk away from that solid foundation, which is very powerful. You know, Mars buys 100% of our palm oil that's certified, more than 50% now of cocoa, for example, and coffee and tea and many other materials. We believe certification is powerful. However, right now, there's significant deepening and strengthening of the oversight around what's really going on at the farthest ends of global supply chains so that that certification really has meaning and really does give the assurance that it's supposed to give. So part of our effort today is engaging closely with the certifying bodies and pushing a deeper conversation about what is happening on the ground for an entity, a farm or plantation, to achieve certification, and how can this have more weight and teeth and gravity and depth, and bearing in mind that really what we're talking about is change in human behavior. This isn't sort of a, you know, are there child laborers here, yes or no? You know, this is about helping people to open up to the complex realities at a community level and get on the path to the right direction on these issues, which are very complex. So it's not as easy as showing up with checklists and flip charts and simple indicators. We think there needs to be a deeper, more nuanced approach around the drivers of these issues and then how to get at them as a part of certification. Hope that's helpful.
So I'm going to use my prerogative as the moderator for a couple more questions, and then after that, I think let's try to open it up. I'll call on folks, I'll know to call on folks by you guys doing this if you have something that you want to chime in on. So don't be shy, but I do want to put Sean on the spot as far as some of this is concerned. I think everyone knows how big of a fan I am of Verité's work, and I think a lot of folks around the table have worked with them in various ways. How do you resist when somebody new comes to you, Sean, and basically wants you to come in and give them that seal of approval? You do resist, and you resist well, but how do you take them to that next level as far as that this is really something that you're inviting them to work together on instead of seal of approval?
Yeah, thanks, Lou. Obviously, the role of certification, similar to what Marika had to say, plays a role, particularly because there is an infrastructure there to work with. But I really want to agree with her point and underscore the fact that certification regimes really do need to deal with labor and human rights issues much more forcefully, with much more skill, and in particular in close cooperation with unions and labor-oriented civil society organizations, which is a structural weakness. I think what we do when we're talking with companies, we do not endorse any particular certification regime. So from the beginning, we're working with them more to understand what role certification can play in a larger set of practices. The key thing really with certification is it helps companies make choices. A certificate is a signaling device. I think within the forced labor and trafficking arena, I feel that we're still quite a ways away from a meaningful certificate. I think that it would be a mistake to move in that direction. I just want to put that out there straight away. I think there are ways, though, within this world that we can help signal which companies, including which labor recruiters, which are the agencies, the companies that are really at the heart of very much of the labor trafficking risk that many companies face, how you separate good behavior from bad behavior, and most particularly improving behavior. Because too much of the dialogue in this arena is about who's good, who's bad. Tell me who has slaves, tell me who doesn't. And that's just actually preposterous because the problem is so systematic. And so really what we need to do, to Mike's point, is have stronger metrics around who's doing genuine engagement, what does genuine progress mean, How do we ensure that that progress, the indicators of success, match up with and are informed by the workers themselves, so that we know success is something that's meaningful to the most vulnerable? And then say, how do we make that data available to companies so in their supply chain choices of the suppliers they're buying from, and in their accountability for their suppliers about how they recruit workers, there is some meaningful choices that are provided. So I think those are some of the issues I think are important to get out on the table.
So the siren song of a clean bill of health certification is not just in the companies, I think. Krishna Patel over at Grace Farms, as you guys have been putting together the large awareness campaign that you're working on, I recall that a bunch of the folks from the ad agencies, the first thing they said when they came in was, and we'll give everybody a logo that they can have that says that they're slave-free. Can you walk us through kind of how you've been dealing with that as far as the need for your corporate partners to have something, but maybe not something that overstates what's happening out there?
Sure. So thank you also for including us here in this conversation. To Cyrus Vance's point, I came, from 17 years in government into this, and it took the experts at WPP to say to us that we have not been doing a good job communicating this to the rest of the world. And to their credit, they have spent the last year kind of taking this on. And one of the things they were very excited about is approaching companies, and WPP, for those who may know, works with many of the corporations out there. And so they had approached a lot of their own clients about this issue, and many of their own clients are having these conversations because of the way that market share and consumers are now purchasing. Very excited about the idea of certification. And as we delved deeper, there were two things that were very clear, that there is no supply chain that seems to be clean. And second, that the idea of a certification, I do think maybe a long way away. And so in creating the campaign, they found it very important to have some kind of icon that was meaningful, but the icon was just that, to have companies and brands commit to the idea of a genuine and meaningful commitment to improving their systems.
And in the spirit of collaboration, I think that Grace Farms is going to be doing a soft launch and some fundraising around that on the 14th
of October.
Grace Farms out in Connecticut. I know a number of you have been to some of the other trafficking forums at Grace Farms, and we certainly look forward to seeing that come live. One of the certifications that's not necessarily a business certification is a pledge, a code of conduct that ECPAT, the group that focuses very much on child pornography and child prostitution and trafficking, has shopped around over the last decade and gotten a lot of folks in the hospitality industry to look at. And that code is not self-executing. It takes hard work on the ground. And I know that the Attorney General's office in Florida, Madam Attorney General, you've been doing quite a bit to try to get the word out in the hotel industries, the trucking industry, et cetera. How do you take these kind of nebulous things like the ECPAT code and then make it so that it's a real meaningful thing for the business owners?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. And when Sean was talking about certification, there's a long way to go before you get to certification, like you said, not getting ahead of ourselves. And that's really bringing awareness to these corporations. How it started in Florida, and of course we're the third largest state, so we received the third largest number of calls to the human trafficking hotline in the country. The truckers reached out to me, and just at the time, the head of the Trucking Association was a woman. And not that men don't care as much, but it was a woman, and she reached out to me and said, let's get the truckers involved. And that's when we started Truckers Against Trafficking. And who better to be our eyes and ears on the road than the truckers? And they have taken the ball and run with it. The emergency, and this goes more to the sex trafficking, but labor as well. The emergency room physicians in Florida came to me and said, we know we are seeing cases, it gives me chills every time I say this, of trafficking in the ER, but we don't know what to do. We don't know how to handle it. Now we're currently working with Restaurant and Lodging Association of Florida, Carroll Dover. They have been amazing. They came to us and said, we don't want this in our hotels. We don't want this happening in our state. So they're coming to me, and then we're giving them the tools they need to take it from there. The Associated Industries of Florida, the Florida Chamber of Commerce Foundation. We've even been training police officers on the signs of what to look for. They have a 2-hour class that they can now take in their patrol cars. So these are little practical things, but that are actually life-saving, though, because they're taking this, they're getting their CLE, well, for a lawyer CLE, they're getting their certification, but they're also learning the signs, because we all know trafficking is living among us, and it's so very different, and that's why General Reyes and I have been so involved in the Truckers Against Trafficking and training all of our businesses. And I spoke to a huge group of business leaders, and I said, something you can do is spread the word on the signs of what to look for in human trafficking. And we have a website, youcanstopht.com. Take my name off it, use it for your own. But I told everybody, send it out to the people I spoke to, Sean, that they had General Reyes at millions of employees, and let them learn the signs of human trafficking that we all know already exist, and send it out to their employees, because just like the Uber driver did, who broke up an entire ring of human trafficking, a flight attendant, we all know, saw it on the plane, put a sticky in a bathroom. I mean, think how ingenious that was, with a marker to a young girl, do you need help? And she responded, yes. Uber now in the state of Florida has started a pilot program where they've trained all their Uber drivers in Florida. So it's little by little, but I feel like we're chipping away at it that way, and it's really not that little when you start adding in all these organizations, and then we're reaching out to corporations nationwide, and we're also working transnationally with the African government and with the Mexican government as well. And next week I'm bringing multiple prosecutors from Mexico to Florida, and we're training them on cybercrimes, because that's something they're lacking in Mexico.
And one of the I think, best examples of worker-driven social responsibility and supply chains and the partnership that they've been able to do, not only with the companies, the buyers themselves, Walmart, McDonald's, and others, but also with the Growers Association there in Central Florida, the folks from the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which I think a lot of us have worked with over the years, are knee-deep in water, a week into not having electricity or running water, and yet their members are out clearing brush, clearing trailers from other folks. I think it shows the spirit of rebuilding that we see in Florida, that the most vulnerable people who got hit the hardest, just like what happened with Hurricane Andrew when it hit Homestead and destroyed the migrant camps back then. We see that now with the Immokalee workers. So I will put in a pitch that any of you who are currently funding the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, think about adding a zero. And if you're not, think about how you can support. They're actually trying to raise for the response there in Immokalee and that entire area. So I want to open it up a little bit. And speaking of Walmart, great to see that you're here.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. My name's Anvin Fan, and I'm in the Global Government Affairs group and part of the team that works on issues related to responsible sourcing and global sourcing. I wanted to touch back on the conversation we're having on certification. It's something we're thinking about as we look at our tuna supply chains. We're taking a deep look at our tuna supply chains as one of our 20 sustainable chains that we're looking at, and we're beginning to integrate the business and looking at social issues in terms of workers that are working on the vessels, on the longliners, the purseines, and also looking at the environmental issues, bycatch and overfishing and illegal fishing. And I wanted to touch back on certification. I'm no expert in certification, but we look at options in what we can do internally and also externally. We've been working, this is current and ongoing, working with Bain Consulting and also MRAG, which is an environmental consulting group, and looking at what we can do amidst our own realities. We do not want to, we have shelf space for tuna, and we're beginning to look at how much shelf space do we give to certified brands, to brands that have a certification. And also, what I really wanted to add is two-part, the issue of cost. Do these certified, tuna, does it add cost? And will consumers in our stores buy that? It provides a different option, but also the story behind it. A lot of the certification, even as someone who's reading up on it, trying to understand what they actually mean. And we are also thinking, what does it mean to have an environmental certification versus a social certification? If you say social certification, does it mean the ones that aren't certified, then you're saying, guarantee that it's made then with, human slavery, for instance. So we're thinking through these types of issues. And one of the things that we're beginning to explore and think about is how to expand our own private label brand. That's where we have more control. When we're working with the bumblebees and we're depending on their sort of sourcing and their strategy, and we do have impact and influence over that. But looking carefully at what we can do in terms of influencing our direct chain and providing more sustainable brands on the shelf, because ultimately we don't want to divide between products that are certified and those that are not, because what are we saying about those products? We ultimately want to provide more shelf space at an affordable rate for products that have an integrated social and sustainable promise to the consumer. So it's a lot of hard work, and it takes a little bit of that Google 10X thinking, where we're try to be audacious and thinking about how can we solve for these problems and not exclude certain segments of the society that cannot afford, a $4 tuna can. It may be, to a lot of us, it may not make a difference, but to a lot of people who need a low-cost protein, it will make a difference. So, thank you.
Thanks, Lou. It's a pleasure to be here. Historically, if you look at the International Labour Organization, we've always, I guess I would brand it as it's been a complicated relationship we've had with certification schemes, to say the least. Why is that? If we take a few steps back, what can we really expect from any certification scheme? At its best, an accurate snapshot of the very moment the auditing took place. What was happening before, up to that moment, and what has happened since then has nothing to do with the certification or the auditing. We have no clue what has been happening and what will continue to happen. It's really that specific moment. And I emphasize, at its best, we get an accurate image of what's happening. So, I think it's good to have certification. I encourage everyone to also look at the cost that it entails and where else that investment could go. Do we think about working with the local labor inspectors, enhancing their capacity, giving them training on what signs they should watch for? What are the signs and indicators of forced labor in the factory, for example? Are we working with the judges and local prosecutors, the police? Are we, or we're just going for certifications because in case something hits the fan, we say, hey, we're certified. I think these are all the different issues. The newest global estimates with our partners, Walk-Free and IOM, that we just launched this morning, says that there's 16 million people in the private economy still in forced labor today. 16 million people. So even if certification programs have been working, they haven't been working well enough. Okay, you can say maybe the numbers would be much higher if there were no certification. Again, we can argue. But, I just wanted to make those comments. And I think very fascinating revelation by our data, the most recent global estimates, is that when you look at agriculture and domestic work or manufacturing, 70% of people that are found to be in forced labor are in a debt bondage situation. Thank you.
So I think, Hannah, you're up, and then Monique and Nick, and then we'll come around.
Thank you. My question is motivated by Anbin, and I hope she answers, but I open the door to other representatives from the private sector. I'd really like to know a little bit more about the tangible and how partnerships or how collaboration or shared information, at least, can be beneficial. In looking at this first piece of the conversation and ensuring that smart policies are smartly implemented, Walmart has a huge footprint. What you decide to do in the next, however long your time frame is going to make massive implications across the supply chain, and that's amazing and powerful. And it means that there's a lot of good that's potential, but also that I would hope that it's done pristinely. So how specifically do you find or source your information when you're thinking about what your consumers are willing to pay or not? What's your process like on that? Is it a simple, survey poll? Like I'm just asking. And then how do you also balance your interests? Because of course you're responding to shareholders, but you're also responding now to millennial consumers and different generations. And so there's just a lot of moving pieces. So I'm curious about the process that you're actually putting in place here and where groups around this table can maybe add value.
So part of this stems a lot from our work in Tuna. It's beginning to have the conversation about where our consumers are, who's shopping in our stores, what are they interested in, what are their priorities, and who are we trying to attract. And more than just the consumer side, also who are we trying to become? And our CEO, Doug McMillon, has talked about becoming the most trusted retailer. And we have a long way to go, and it's a journey. As far as our information source, we have been working off surveys. We're in the beginning of our journey, but it is very important for us to understand where the consumer is at. And so that's the beginning of the dialogue we're having on how do we tell the story. And Kathleen McLaughlin is our Chief Sustainability Officer and head of President of Walmart Foundation. She's very keen about this, actually. How can we engage the consumer, and the reality is consumers often say they care about these issues. They will repeatedly report in surveys, this is what I care about. But when you're shopping, buying off the shelf, you're making quick decisions. You're not standing there. Many of us the same. You're not scanning barcodes or looking, and the future is there with blockchain and whatnot. That's something we're also investing in terms of information on the supply chain, where we can get insight. But I think that's why we're taking a hard look and saying, how can we provide this on our shelf? So we're doing the hard work in advance, and it's not just about, this is, the demand is more, because the truth is, that consumers, although they may care, their money, their pocketbook, may not represent that at the cashier.
Monique?
Thank you, Lou. Pleasure to see you again. And thank you for Cy and for Mike for mentioning the efforts that we do at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. When just a few things, you spoke of collaboration, of data, of business, and I'm really amazed that one word has not been pronounced here. Two, indeed. Corruption, which is fundamental to the business of trafficking, and media to shed light on what is going on. And I will take just an example, but have millions. But we created last year the Stop Slavery Award. The idea was to honor the corporations that were the best in class to try to clean their supply chain from forced labor. And as you know, there is a lot of reticence from some sides of the industries and all the different industries to accept the word slavery. And so we were delighted that for the first Stop Slavery Award, you had so many big corporations who were candidates, and I'm speaking of Apple, of Tesco, and many others. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise and NXP Semiconductors won the first awards. This year, we have many, many more candidates. We will publish the list of the 15 shortlisted tomorrow, but I can tell in avant-première here, because Walmart is there, that Walmart is one of the 15. But all others like Adidas and many, many others, and even banks are shortlisted. What I saw and what Cyrus saw and many others who are on the jury is that there is a direct correlation between a company that starts to investigate their supply chain, and it's incredibly complicated, and they all struggle terribly to do that. But there is a direct motivation, which is when from whatever quarter media has paid attention to their wrongdoing, either in their production or in their supply chain, or because they are in a risky industry. As soon as a corporation has media attention, they start immediately to act. And you can look at all the candidates of last year, it was that, this year again. And then the second thing, which was really interesting, looking at this very deep questionnaire of 8 pages that takes a week to fill for the candidates. What was really interesting is that all of them didn't know how to look really in their supply chain, and asked to the likes of Verité, of ISARA project, etc., around the world to help them navigate this world. So certification maybe not, but the help of the ones who are in the know and who really know their turf in different countries is indispensable. So I just wanted to mention that, to tell you that I think we have done an incredible progress in the last 5-6 years to first raise awareness on slavery. I agree with Cyrus, we are not enough vocal about the issue, but still huge progress. People know, you have a campaign this week, since last week, in the UK, the Evening Standard, which is a newspaper that is given away in the tube to 500,000 readers every day, has a campaign on slavery and has done a lot of investigation, and they're going to do that for 3 months. It's huge. If you have USA Today starting the same campaign here, it would change things. So awareness is coming, but also all these companies who work with peers and with others to try to address the issue, I think makes me much more optimistic than 5 years ago.
Excellent. And we're going to have, I think, built into the third act of the questions, a little more of that as far as what are some of the incentives, whether it's awards or otherwise. So I hope that people who are listening to what Monique was teeing up for us, write it down and save that little part for the third act. We're going to start finishing up. We're going to have to do a little bit of speed rounding to get through this initial question about certifications, et cetera. And I think that our next up was Nick, and then Peter. And Peter, I was going to ask you earlier, and if you could build this in just a little bit, draw on your ICI days as far as what you saw in cocoa specifically, with, to the extent that consumers were going to be looking at price versus quality, and I think of slave-free as being one of the quality points. But then maybe if you could compare that to what ETI is doing, which is not sector-specific, because I think we want to take the last few minutes of this chapter to talk about sector-specific versus the broader things, much as Mike had teed up for us, and where do you get that balance. So if you can build that in, I'd appreciate it. But Nick, this is a long way to get back over to calling on you.
Well, I appreciate that we're just about to wrap up the discussion around certification. I mean, my point from the perspective of the Freedom Fund, the organisation I lead, is that certification is such a small part of the discussion, and very rightfully so. If we're talking about the new global estimate of 40 million people in slavery, and you're looking at certification as a solution for that, then you're leaving out the vast bulk of those. Certification, if it's feasible, which is a very big if, is relevant to consumer-facing goods, and predominantly Western consumer-facing goods, goods where price sensitivity may or may not be an issue, and that's such a small part of what we're talking about. I mean, at the Freedom Fund, if we talk about slavery, we look at India, right, with estimated, 13, 14, 15 million people in slavery. Not consumer facing in terms of Western consumers, right? It's people working in stone quarries and brick kilns and factories, and these will never be goods that end up in any kind of certification process, even if we can get there. And I sometimes worry that we focus on what appear to be, and I'm not suggesting anyone is saying this, but attractive solutions, because of course a robust certification process would be very attractive. But if you look at something like apparel, and I'm no expert in this space, but and if you look at a extremely simplified supply chain that is Western high street fast fashion company supplying from a manufacturer in South Asia that that manufactures all of those goods. Some of those go off to home workers. Some of those, all the material comes out of a milling factory and is potentially sourced from Uzbekistan. Well, major corporates sitting around this table will tell us that they struggle to get 2 tiers down. And many of these supply chains will be 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And so I think to the extent that we're talking about this, we should be focusing very much on greater transparency. That's really important, and that's a part of certification. And there is a big tide of regulation coming down this space, which I think is great because I think it changes the incentives for corporations to devote more resources to this, which is a really welcome thing. So we have the UK Modern Slavery Act that we've just talked about and transparency provisions. The Australian government announced it's going to introduce transparency legislation. UK government has just introduced a criminal finances bill that talks about gross human rights abuses and criminal culpability for links around this. All of this will drive greater transparency, and maybe in 5 or 10 years' time we can talk more then about certification as a tool for a small segment of the space.
Indeed. Peter, if you could.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute and to the organisers. It occurs to me that there's there's a well-known rhyme in Ireland that if you were going to Dublin, you wouldn't start from here. So I think the answer to the question, if we really want to drive out things like modern slavery, forced labour, I wouldn't start with the question about is certification the right way. I would say, what do we have in our toolkit, of which certification is certainly one of the tools? And then when and how do we apply the right combination of tools? And this is sort of talking to Nick's point. Interesting, no one's mentioned the UNGP so far. And yet the UNGP's call out for a due diligence process that is informed by rights holders, that talks to trade unions, that engage NGOs. And to your point about not being sector specific, what ETI is trying to do with its 90 corporate members, trade unions and NGOs is say, maybe we've just not understood the system right. So we're applying solutions, we're applying patches, but maybe they're addressing the symptoms and not the underlying causes. So I think the answer to certification or not is how much do you understand why the things are happening that you're seeing? It may be poor governance, it may be business practices, it may be weak civil society. Certification may be part of the solution, but actually it might be bulking up with your peer group, it might be working with trade unions, it might be further investigation and analysis. So I think that's the way we would encourage as a first step. And we think this is fantastically difficult for companies to do on their own. It's also fantastically difficult to have the courage to do it, because inevitably when you lift the rock up, you find things that you didn't want to see. So there is a certain comfort in doing that with your peer group. There's a certain comfort, as Monique said, doing this with experts, because experts will take you to places you can't go on your own. And then you can sit down and say, what tools do we have to hand that we can apply? And I love the various things that are happening in Florida. How can we mix and match these things? Maybe there's a need for innovation. Maybe we just don't have the toolkit in this particular case. So I think that's what we would feel it's an important way to start the conversation. And if you like, and again, tribute to Mars and all the other companies that were around the Cocoa Initiative table, they allowed us to do that piece of research and avoid the simple project approach, but we started to look around what were the drivers of why children were working on farms. And it was things like no education, it was things like lack of awareness of the risk, it was things like desperate poverty. So how do you start to tackle those? What can companies do themselves? But also, what could companies do in terms of engaging Minister of Finance and presidents and prime ministers and start to say, look, we're in this together. We win or lose together. So I think there's a lot in understanding the systems. I think there are some great individual projects, some fantastic individuals, but I think we've not wired those up effectively in many places. I think the more that we can bring businesses sort of call to action, complement that skill set and engagement we'll start to see the greater progress. I am an optimist. I think there is a lot of good work going on. There's a lot to build on. And then maybe to answer your last question, it's a very difficult one, and again, reflecting on ICI days, but not only. If product A is a good one, then what's product B sitting on the shelf? I don't think that's acceptable. I think we have to make all products above the line. If there are then attributes to a product A that people are more attracted to, then that's fine. But we're talking about human rights standards here, so above the line is where we have the differentiation and not below. Easier said than done. But as a last point, and it really speaks to the harnessing partnerships, we know this has to be done in partnership. It's wiring up those partnerships in a way that reflects the specific circumstances and the specific needs. So it's the next sort of frontier, I think.
Hi, thank you for inviting me to the conversation. I think I want to piggyback actually on what Peter said. Someone yesterday said that slavery is the symptom, and if slavery is the symptom, then I think we know poverty and disempowerment are in fact the disease. And the only answer then is really making sure that workers are actually part of the solution. I think we've seen over time that compliance and auditing systems just aren't working. And companies and governments need to see workers as part of the solution and as actual co-collaborators if you want to solve labor problems. So some of the things that we've learned over time is that worker-driven models, like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, the Equitable Food Initiative, there are lots of them out there. These are the kinds of models that we would point people to, and whether it's a certification or not, I don't think is really the issue, but really how the monitoring is happening and that workers are actually part of that monitoring system. I'm also struck that how little I hear unions as being part of the solution and actually being in these conversations, and would really encourage all of us to ensure that unions are actually part of the conversation and part of the partnerships. And the role of collective bargaining, because we know that when workers actually are able to collectively bargain, they're then not in situations like we're trying to address. So those are the kinds of things that I think we would prefer to see over just looking at certifications.
Well, that's a great tee up to Abby, I think, with ILRF, and especially with the union aspects.
Absolutely. You don't get forced labor in unionized workplaces. You don't, because workers have an agreement in place and a legally binding remedy in order to be able to seek some sort of remedy when that situation happens. I really strongly agree with Arit that workers need to be a part of the solution. I think that workers need to have spaces at tables like this. I think they need to be part of the international discussion. But I also think that we need to look at models like the Bangladesh Accord on Fire and Factory Safety for how they can affect this problem. There you have an agreement between government inspectors, between brands, between local suppliers, and between worker representatives to solve a problem, and you have very clearly identified who is doing what within those problems and who is putting what they bring to the table to develop a solution. We do not believe in certification models that strongly. A lot of workers have died in certified factories, and what we think is more important for companies to invest in is looking at their procurement structures. So no matter what kind of supplier protocols or codes of conduct you put into place, if you are pushing down your supply chain that prices have to be lowered and saying that you have to have faster and faster turnaround times, that's going to mean longer hours and lower pay for the workers on the factory floor. So ensuring long-term suppliers, contracts with suppliers that ensure when they increase their labor costs, they will have a partner there who's going to buy those goods, I think is very important. I also think businesses have a part to play in policy remedies too. However, just today, we released a letter in support of 14 migrant workers who are under attack for criminal defamation in Thailand currently for reporting on conditions of forced labor at their employers. We got 87 different organizations from around the world, including some businesses, particularly European poultry importers and some Scandinavian retailers. I think that all businesses should be standing up
when human rights advocates are under attack, and should be saying that use of criminal defamation, which is dramatically increasing in Thailand against migrant workers, is unacceptable. And if you supply from Thailand, you should be letting the government know that you do not want them to engage in those practices anymore. And I think we also need to look at what companies are lobbying for. So even if you have respect for freedom of association in your supply code, but you are either directly or indirectly through chambers of commerce's advocating for laws that decrease worker protections on the job, or that expand temporary work programs that provide fewer protections than what you have in your own supply chain of conduct, there's kind of a disconnect there. And the final thing that I'll say is that I think that the public-private partnership is important, and we need all of those actors working together to bring what they have to the table, but that we also need to be investing in genuine worker remedies too. When I think about, the partners that I work with all over the world, the small unions, the kinds of funding that it takes to put on these sorts of events or to be at this table is just unbelievable amounts of money for them, right? They wouldn't even know what to do with it. But, $20,000 a year for 4 years to invest in rights training and organizing so that workers can better negotiate with their own employers to fix contracts and to get, certain supply chains working in certain areas can really go a very long way. And I encourage funders and governments to think about that.
Thank you, Abby. Marina? Unless you put it down because you don't want to talk anymore.
Oh, no, I will definitely say something. I was going to make the point about the certification processes really expanding into becoming like beyond that point in time certification to more of a supplier engagement process. And I think also it's really critical to have that process take place down the supply chain, really at the bottom of the chain, just to emphasize, like really involving that direct worker input, feedback, and looking also at issues that Abby pointed out around costs and price, how those pressures are, go down to the supply chain, to the suppliers, increase often the amount of time to produce, the impact that cost and price has on wages, all of these considerations to be really taken into account in terms of developing these partnerships at the bottom of the chain and looking at the enabling environments in the communities that are also affected, and the institutions. I just think that's really a growing field in terms of being able to bring the technology in to better identify and connect with the workers and bring their information and data into the supply chain to move, both up and down. That was my input. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. And I want to use the moderator's prerogative again to thank Marina for her last 4 years worth of service at USAID. I think a lot of us around the table have reaped the benefits of the programs that she conceived, that she funded, that she got out into the field, building on the work that she'd done before at ILO and other places. It really was a loss, I think, to all of us that fellowships do have an end date and that inevitably came. So thank you, and we're glad that you're here and that you're not going to leave the fight. But we will leave this first question behind because it's time. And we borrowed a little bit from the future, but that's in part because we've already covered a few of those questions as we've drifted forward in a positive way. I want to talk a little bit about tech. I think that it's something that we've seen as the District Attorney Vance has kind of pointed out to us. A lot of the early tech here in the U.S. has been focused on sex trafficking. Whether it's stoplight, whether it's traffic jam, whether it's all of these MEMX tools. I was at that first meeting when we were talking to DARPA in Silicon Valley, and only in the trafficking space can you have the Special Forces guys and the brainiacs from DARPA, along with MC Hammer and Ashton Kutcher in a room talking about how you end up fighting trafficking. But at the time, we all kind of were thinking about what's the easiest thing to interdict. We're the soft underbelly of trafficking, very much the internet, sex trafficking, etc. But I think that that's enough years have gone by that we have to think about what are the only, or what are the other things. Government seems to be using sex trafficking tech tools, businesses, whether it's the Freedom Act, whether it's some of the things that are coming out of the chain, etc. People are in the business side using more of the labor trafficking tools. How can we maybe cross-pollinate that a little bit? So with that in mind, I wanted to first talk a little bit about data itself. Data is only as good, or data analysis and this type of stuff is only as good as what data is even available. IBM kind of invented data for most of us, and so I'm going to ask Chris if he's got some thoughts for us. Talk about the first mover advantage with IBM back in the day.
Oh, thank you. How did I know I was not going to get this question? Thank you to Concordia and Winrock for our participation here, and we do appreciate being at the conference and on the panel. I think everyone would agree that the greater use of data analytics would help increase awareness of any problem you're trying to solve. I mean, it gives you insights into identifications and patterns. It improves the ability to share and act on intelligent analysis. So what have you got? There's vast amounts of untapped data, and we're making more every day around the world. It is an asset, whatever you're trying to do. What we want to do is try to make the data help our counter efforts more effective, precise, and operational. The goal is faster action from point of data acquisition and then interdiction. You can't do predictive analytics unless you do forensics on the historical data you got. So from our perspective, we see the explosion of data and a challenge and a great opportunity. And first thing to do is capture and assess the data for relevance, correlation, trend identification, things of that nature. So what did I just say? I think any technology provider, whoever you use, there's four things or three things that are really a key. Number one, you have to have a data plan. How big is the data? How fast do you need the data? Is it reliable data? Is it clean? Is it information that you're going to use? So when you build a data plan, you can't just have technology companies sit there and build you a data plan. You'll end up with a technology data plan. You need your business folks or people that are going to use the data, your analysts, to help you build that plan. And that's a key. I see it all the time. Everybody gets caught up in technology, and my background has been building, for lack of better terms, catching bad guy applications and three-letter agencies and things of that nature. And the first thing you have to do is figure out who's going to use this data and how you're going to use it. That's number one. Number two is you've got to build it to kind of an open standard. You can't let your technology provider build it so that they're going to control it. You want to be able to take advantage of the next technology that comes along. People move faster than, look at your smartphone. So you have to be able to build that data so that you can transform it, move it, analyze it, and be able to move it to the next generation. Those are key. And the big elephant in the room is data sharing. And I have seen this problem since DHS was formed everywhere. Not to make, DHS has done a wonderful job in a lot of areas, but we've got to be able to, we around this table trying to solve this problem, get with the governments, the NGOs, and share the data that we have. The data's there, people. And IBM, Microsoft, whoever you use, we can connect the dots. And so what we need to do, is get together and solve that problem. I think that's the biggest problem. So Did that help?
Definitely. Thank you, Chris. I'd actually, Duncan, if you can, as we connect the dots, we have to connect them to something, and we have to take it somewhere. I know Liberty Asia has been working with FATF and the other folks out in the money laundering world, but also in the banking world, which is a soft point, I think, for businesses and traffickers and everything else. How do you take, crunch, and deliver data? Where are the places where you've seen decent data that can come up? And can you introduce us, and all within 3 minutes, to the concept that some folks I think are very familiar with, but others who aren't working in banking and that sector, to the idea of some of the typologies that are out there that drive money laundering and enforcement?
Thanks, Lou, and thank you to Concordia for inviting me. I was my ability to talk about this because I was a general counsel and head of compliance of a large financial institution across Asia Pacific for about 15 years, and did a lot of anti-money laundering, both ran a team, but did a lot of white-collar crime investigation. And Liberty Asia's work, some of it comes from that. I think very quickly, I find that anti-slavery work, human trafficking work divides into two sorts of daily operation. There are many, many people doing victim care, and then there are another bunch of people who are looking, which I think is a lot of this conversation, about how do you restrict the environment in which exploitation can thrive. And part of that is stopping people from benefiting from exploitation. Now, the two connect very well together, and that's certainly where we come in a very structural way, is because the data that comes from the victims is the only piece of information that tells you about how people, what criminal activities are taking place, and therefore how people are benefiting from those activities. So if we don't have victim data, then we don't really have much to build the rest on. I think building from what was just said, the big question about constructing a data set, as any data scientist will tell you, is you've got to know what question you're trying to ask. And the problem with building data into victim case management systems with relation to victim care people is that they're not asking any questions because they don't need to. Their big question is every morning is, how am I caring for the person in front of me? It is because you're deciding on there's a targeted way to use data that you've got some questions. And the question that Lou refers to is, how do you use it to stop banking transactions? Now, not to be dismissive at all, but the first element of that is red flags. It's kind of the adverse list, the reg flags, the Thomson Reuters world checks, Factivas. Those are the first to call. Politically exposed people. The second bit is, how do we really make a difference at a structural level to see, is the type of business in the banking services we're offering the type of banking service we want to offer? HSBC pulled out of Cambodia because in the end they decided it's just too much of a risk. ANZ pulled out of their Royal ANZ Cambodian joint venture because at the end of the day they decided there was too much risk after that sugar joint venture. So, that requires more than adverse lists and red flags. It requires a structural look, and what we and a couple of others have done is look at typologies. Taking the victim data from NGOs who've thought about this and discussed this, building what essentially is a bottom-up approach, taking the crime and seeing who benefits from it, and it goes all the way back to the retailers. And you come back to the question of certification. In relation to tuna in Mexico, MSC has just certified it, but the World Wildlife Fund has big objections. We have certainly taken our typologies from Southeast Asia, looked at MSC's certification, and we would like to have a discussion with them about how some of those are certified and what is the underlying reason for that. So once you start to build from crime and exploitation up, and you build benefit, which is the opposite to a supply chain analysis. You don't know where it's going to go, although after a while you have a pretty good idea, because as we all just said, it tends to head west for a start. Then that data is where you can use, and that then you can then work into, because it's criminal benefit. You have, as Nick said, the Criminal Finances Act. You have speaking to Homeland Security, and we tried through 4B of the Patriot Act to start to move information into FinCEN and then through the banks. And the truth is the Patriot Act is a pretty difficult act to unlock. But to all due credit to HSTC and FinCEN, we actually came to understanding how we can actually share information with HSTC and then they will share it with FinCEN. Now, traditionally, that would only be done if there was an ongoing case. And it's not necessarily HSTC's interest to focus on necessarily human trafficking, particularly where there is forced labor actually occurring outside of the US. But in this particular case, there was a concerted effort to try and figure out how to get that information to move, and it's now moving. And I think there's a lot of credit that goes to figuring that out. So there are these moods, but there are these channels and mechanisms that are being created. And we certainly have regular calls with a variety of financial institutions ranging from money service providers to Thomson Reuters, Factiva, to banks, sharing information, seeing how it can move. But to come back to Abby's point, defamation is a big problem. As a general counsel, I was on the receiving end of a number of defamation suits from around Asia. In actual fact, in the Philippines, if you report to a regulator about another company in confidence, it still can be a defamation case. And I don't think there is enough wisdom in the anti-trafficking community at the moment about that issue. It's going to set some very unhealthy precedents, like it will ultimately do in Thailand, particularly where you have corrupt judiciary and a very fungible government.
So, Ken, as HSTC, the Human Smuggling Trafficking Center, and FinCEN, the financial crimes folks, et cetera, can be getting information, whether it's through the kind of thing that Liberty Asia is sharing or what have you. How can Homeland Security, and I guess speak larger for all of federal law enforcement perhaps, how can that information come in and help you as you're making kind of these targeted and targeting decisions about entities? It's a little different than it used to be when it was about specific traffickers. Now with the Tariff Act, you're starting to look at goods that are coming in, et cetera. How do you separate wheat from chaff in something like that?
It's actually not very easy, clearly. And first, thank you, Concordia, for the invitation. So the laws that we use as the foundational laws here are old. They're almost 100 years old, and they are incredibly difficult to work with. They come from an era of much simpler supply chains. They would be used to target a particular company, which is not our focus now, or a particular country. So we need to find ways to use laws that were not intended for this purpose. So that's where financial crimes come in. If a company is materially benefiting from a scheme of forced labor, that is something we would be very interested in, because to follow a supply chain back through 12 or 15 steps is not viable, because the law is wrapped around the importation of the goods, so we have to prove the importation and the relation to the site of forced labor. That is incredibly difficult these days, so whether it's materially benefiting from a scheme of forced labor or knowledge that forced labor is in the supply chain, those are the two areas that we focus on. And going back to a few earlier points about certification, to be perfectly honest, we're not terribly interested in certification schemes by companies, mostly because, as was pointed out, it's a snapshot in time. It is a continuous look at their supply chains that is more interesting to us. So if we go to a company and either detain goods at the border and then present the company with their 90 days to refute that, presentation of we have certified and we're a member of whatever stamp is on the label that day is not going to be a viable defense. It is going to be the company's continuous actions to look at their supply chain and see what's going on there, look at their suppliers, which change frequently over time, and that's going to be the dialogue that is much more important. So the idea that there is a sort of a bar you can reach through research, that's just not going to happen.
Thanks, Ken. I'm going to ask Marcia, and then we'll go to Attorney General Reyes. But Marcia, DOL ends up having to look at that then, not for the particular employer or the particular shipping container or whatever, but you're looking at data, you're looking at information, et cetera, and every year you're coming out with surprisingly granular information about sectors, about products, et cetera, kind of at the country level. Other than the fact that a lot of the people who used to work for me at the trafficking office are working for you, and I know how great they are, how do you pull that off year in and year out? That is a massive data project, isn't it?
Well, thank you, Lou, and thank you to Concordia, and thank you for training and sharing a lot of your staff who are actually now working for us and helping us collect data. We at the Department of Labor actually publish reports on an annual basis, cover about 135 countries, and looking at the worst form to child labor and looking at the efforts that are being made to address child labor, enforced labor, and human trafficking. We also publish regularly a list of goods that are made with child labor or forced labor in violation of international standards. One of the things that we've heard in many years is that, there's too much information out there, and, we need to stop collecting information and we need to kind of do some action. But one of the things that I would say is that there is still like a huge lack of information when it comes to even data related to enforcement. And I wanted to kind of take a minute to talk about that because we spent some time talking about certification, and I agree with all the comments that were made about the fact that certification, it is looking at issue at one point in time. And where we need, I feel that where we need to make more effort and where we need to focus on is on building the capacity of governments to actually enforce the laws that they have and to actually share information about inspections that they're making, where they're making it, penalties that are being assessed, companies that are being fined, and it's similarly to prosecutions and other things. And that information is not out there. Of the reports that we've published, we have over 1,700 recommendations for governments. 1,100 of those are related to labor enforcement. So that tells you that there is a huge gap in the information that is out there and in the need to focus on that. I also wanted to say that there is a lot, information can be overwhelming. I have talked to a number of companies who have said to me, we're looking at different certification schemes, we're looking at information that is coming from different places. We don't even know sometimes what to do with all of this. Another company said to me, we're still using Excel spreadsheet to actually follow our suppliers. So that actually was a little bit shocking to me that was actually happening. And this is actually a major company, and I won't mention their name, but it was a little bit surprising to me that was happening. So even within companies, and these are forward-leaning companies that need to be applauded and encouraged to continue to do what they're doing and to do more, they still do not have sufficient resources to look into their supply chain and to look at issues that they should be looking at. So as we sit here on the table today, I just want to kind of take a minute to say, when we're looking at reputational risk for companies, from the point of view of the U.S. government, in my job and Ken's job as working for the government, our job is to enforce the law and to help others comply with the law. There are tools out there, including the Tariff Act of 1930, to kind of encourage in very strong ways to companies and countries to do the right thing. But there's also positive things that we can do. For example, through our procurement, we have a big purchasing power, the U.S. government. So who we buy products from and who we do business with actually also send a very strong message out there about how we feel about this issue and where we think our resources should be included. So I will conclude my comments by saying pretty soon we will be releasing updates to our reports, and there is an app out there for almost anything, but we do have a couple of apps that could be very helpful to all of you who are looking at what actions could be taken and what steps can be taken in monitoring supply chains. Thank you.
Mr. Attorney General.
Thank you. I really wanted to talk about the corporate side. I've got like 6 pages of notes, but I couldn't resist. I wanted to ask a question. By the way, can I just say how refreshing it is to be with so many of you who are so passionate about fighting human trafficking? I talk about it every day, all day in my home state, and people act like I'm talking about a zombie apocalypse. They don't understand it. They don't know it. We're trying to wake them up. In fact, my wife said, if you could stop talking about it, people don't invite us to dinner or social events anymore because you're such a downer, just always talking about trafficking and abuse. I think it's really insightful to talk about connectivity and sharing important data. And certainly, to me, the fundamental tenet of success in the fight is we have to fight it locally and globally simultaneously, and we have to all be working together. But here's the conundrum for me, is that I am dedicated to this. I spend an inordinate amount of time. Some constituents probably think too much. I've trained leaders from over 40 countries who've come to little old Salt Lake to talk about this. They all feel disaggregated. They all feel alienated and alone. They don't know where resources are. And even though I have worked with scores, maybe even hundreds of different organizations in the fight against trafficking, I still feel like we're all running around on days with so much energy going in different directions, but maybe not being able to harness that in a cohesive way. And this is just a question I had. And you don't need to answer it now. If somebody can grab me later on and say, look, Sean, we've all figured this out a long time ago, and you're just the fool in the room, and we'll just point you in the right direction. I've literally had people come, heads of state and others, say, is there like a newsletter that we could just read to catch up on all of the different activities? Maybe there is. Maybe there's hundreds of newsletters. I don't even subscribe to one because I don't know if there's kind of a unifying organization. Concordia, certainly, this is a fantastic forum, and I appreciate this step in the right direction. But again, I'm feeling like Senator Hatch. He's just got a bill right now. I don't know if it's passed or it's proposed, an advisory committee for Congress, and they're going to have 14 different organizations and groups. Shoot, I don't know. We should all be talking. Somebody asked me if there was a kind of a Facebook or a yearbook for all of the different organizations involved in the fight. If there is, again, would love to know about it. If you can help me out, or if you think that's foolish. If you think it's a good idea, then maybe send me your ideas too, because I'm willing to expend some capital to try to do something along that line. So again, sorry for the heavy pivot out of sharing critical information at that level, because I don't think we even share it at a baseline level to know who each other are and what we're all doing from day to day.
Anna.
I'm just going to jump in here, and I do not want to speak for any of my colleagues around the table on where they're getting their information. But an anecdote for whenever I talk to anybody about what Concordia is doing, and they say, oh dear God, please don't start another working group or another. So just maybe it's not the proliferation of or creating a new newsletter, but I know from a show of hands, there are many people around this table who run fantastic issue-based conversations that Concordia is happy to participate and learn from. I'm looking at Abby with her ILRF Seafood Working Group. I know NYU and USAID work together on State Department work together on a recruitment working group. So there's just these great conversations, and my plea is not to start another one.
Well, speaking of folks that have done a lot to bring everybody together, I think Jen is next up as far as that, and then we're going to go across to Killian, and I've got a couple questions I'm going to tee up for you as well. But Jen.
Yeah, thanks, Lou, and thanks, everyone. It's great to be part of the discussion. I thought it would be remiss of me not to make a comment on the day where the collaboration with my friend across the room, Hutan from ILO and Walk Free, to announce the joint estimate, which is 40.3 million people. And just to make a couple of comments on data, I think this is a complex issue, and the thing that's more complex than the issue itself is trying to collect accurate data. So I just wanted to make a couple of comments on that. I know that 40.3 million people, some people have said perhaps anecdotally is a conservative number. The number that is less than 40.3 million people are the actual victims that are identified. So to constantly be on the unrelenting pursuit to actually find out who these victims are across the world is really, really important. And it was 5 years ago, I think we did 24 surveys only. Now we're up to something like 60 surveys in almost 50 countries. It takes a lot of time and effort to do these surveys on the ground to get accurate data. So I think the message is that there's an ongoing effort and commitment to ensure that the data is accurate. It's plausible, it's defensible, but there's so much more to do, and there's so many more countries than 60 countries, and it's a combination of those surveys which are the most accurate, and in fact every time we do a survey the number goes up because it's it's showing a more accurate number. And then there's existing data sets from many of the developed countries and then extrapolations from that. In terms of next steps, profits of slavery. We're going to continue to do a collaboration with the ILO and look at the profits of slavery and also products of slavery over the next couple of years. And that is another effort at collecting more data, more accurate data. So I think it's adding to the robustness of that data set, which is really, really important. And I've got a number of other comments I'd like to make about business, but I'll perhaps hold that off to the third point. But I just wanted to make those comments around data. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Killian, one of the things that if you could incorporate in to what you're already planning on saying, when we have all of the good research that, whether it's in the DOL report or in the trafficking report or things like that, which is made for one purpose. It's made for diplomacy, it's made for government regulation, et cetera, et cetera. How do you guys, or speaking for others who do similar risk analysis, how do you then turn that into risk conversations for the companies that you're working with, or the folks who you're bringing into the idea that they should know their chain?
That's great. Thanks so much, Lou, and thanks to Concordia for hosting this discussion. I will give one plug on a newsletter because I know Freedom Fund won't do it. But they do a weekly news roundup bulletin, which I personally find really helpful to stay on top of what's going on.
I second that motion.
Yeah, in the movement. And I'll get to your point, Lou, but one of the things I was reflecting on when we started this section on technology is that 10 years ago this month is when the first iPhone came out. And I think if we look back on how much change we've seen in the technology sector in the past 10 years, I think a lot of us have been optimistic about the opportunity that technology could afford to be an enabler for a lot of these solutions. The pessimist in me would say, well, why have we not seen an acceleration as much as we'd like to see? And to echo Peter's point as well, I think when we think about technology, we need to see it as another tool in our toolbox, not a panacea, not a solution. And then in terms of how you use that information and how you use it for risk, with Know the Chain, what we've looked at is beginning to see the ways in which companies are trying to go deeper in their supply chain by asking them questions. Can you disclose examples of pilots that you've used? And I think we're at a point now where the field is mature enough, 10 years after the iPhone, where we can start seeing an implementation beyond the pilot stage. And I would kind of challenge all of us as partners to say and see what does it mean for us to move some of these new technologies into a space in which they're beyond simply pilot. I would love to engage a corporation and have them talk about how they're rolling out a new concept like blockchain or worker communication system or direct worker engagement system across their entire supply chain, not just one pilot this year. Because what happens next year when they lose budget, they cut that pilot. I think we have enough effective examples and we can start really having a conversation about what it means for more broader implementation across supply chains.
Thanks, Killian. Let's go with Miguel and then over to An and then Katie.
Thank you. I have a remark that may be slightly out of time, but I'll try to rope it into the question on data. But starting with with the question on certification, I just want to echo what Peter Wooten and Irit said. I rather that we think about monitoring and transparency than certification, and I wanted to emphasize this point, particularly when we're thinking about the agricultural sector. I come from a leading multinational tobacco company, and we source tobacco from around 400,000 smallholder farmers in 30 plus countries. So I don't think certification is a useful concept for our reality, but that does not mean that we don't need to have a thorough due diligence process that gives us visibility into what happens at the farm level in the relation between farmers and workers, and critically important for being able to identify problems is as someone said, giving workers a voice. There was mention to metrics. When we're dealing with agricultural sector, I think it's important to understand when we talk about modern day slavery, it's a phenomenon that is coexisting with other illicits, with other situations, more often than not, like illegal migration phenomenon, and you have to be able to disentangle questions that have to do with the legality of the permanence of a worker on a country with the situations of that worker being thoroughly abused. Doing this on a global scale is I think, utterly difficult for any company that is really committed to tackle the root causes of the issues. But I think that's where I think it is really important that monitoring and transparency come together, because it's only by being transparent about what kind of issues, what kind of signs that may be associated with forced labor are being identified on the ground, and being transparent about those, that one can find partners, that can find stakeholders that ultimately help to address the root causes of the problems. I think, I'm just going to preempt the last point on partnerships. I think the main focus of partnerships has to be on dealing with the root causes of these problems. And if you, particularly in the sector that I'm more familiar with, in the ag sector, the root causes have to do with regulatory environment. Companies have to do their bit to make sure that they have visibility. They are creating an environment where they are restricting the conditions for abuse to thrive, but even if they restrict the conditions, there are root causes that need to be tackled. And I can think about structure of supply chains, like situations that we have in Africa, or immigration reform, like the problem we have here in the U.S. And I think the partnerships are really critical to drive change on those root cause problems in support of other initiatives that necessarily need to take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. Anwen?
Thank you. It's good to see you again. It's been since, I think, Ukraine about 7 years ago. But anyway, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the data part and jump on to what Duncan had mentioned, as well as what Christopher had said. 10 years ago, I had a conversation with Kevin Bales, and he was saying, why doesn't IOM share their data? It's so valuable. We could learn so much from that. And we had some BS way of saying why we wouldn't. But the reality is, if we really wanted to at that time, we probably wouldn't have known how to. There's data protection principles. There's the issue of how are you collecting it between missions. There's an issue internally how to do it, and there's an issue of how to do it externally. And I think the reality is that now I think the technology has been able to serve, or has gotten up to what our needs are. And so I think the time is right for us to be able to really get to that part. The trick is, how do you share the data, right? Because before, it was easy for us to do it internally as silos, and so then you have, you've got Polaris data, you've got Liberty Asia data, you've got IOM data, you've got Lestrada data, you've got all of this stuff, but then how do you put it together? And I think that's been the trick that we've been trying to work on, actually, with Polaris and now with Liberty Asia, is how do we make sense of the data, make it comparable, put it together? How do we utilize from the financial sector techniques to anonymize in such a way that we're protecting the individual? And how do we then make use of that? And so just to let you know, it's something that we've been engaging in for the last couple years, and we'll be launching it this year, is what we call the Data Collaborative. With it's not just IOM data, it's Polaris data, it's hopefully Liberty Asia. We just got the first data set from you guys to see if we can mesh it together. Why are we doing it? And that's the real question, right? Because, so why are we putting it together? Why we need to share? And I would, for me, as IOM, I would say the objective for us is a couple things. It's to better identify victims of trafficking, because as we sometimes say simplistically, no victim, no crime. It's to do better a job of interdiction within the law enforcement, to inform us to be able to respond to that, and to better care for the victims of trafficking. And I would say that I think that somebody had mentioned we have to understand why we're trying to do it. And I would say for us, when we take a look at the data collection and the things that we're doing, is to really take a look at for me, those 3 areas that are really key. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you.
I will have to say that even if it might not have been as perfect or as well done as An suggests that it could have been, the fact of that first IOM data set that grew out of the hospital in Kiev was for many years the only place that we could go and dip into that. And out of that came the recognition of men victims. Out of that came the recognition of women labor trafficking victims, which was always at one point seen as just the male iteration of it. And maybe even more importantly, the idea of why do women refuse to go into a shelter? Why do people go home? Why do they get re-trafficked, et cetera? None of that happens in the kind of the modern trafficking world. Things that we all think of as just kind of what everybody knows never would have happened if Rebecca Surtees and Steve Warnoth and IOM and everybody hadn't been working with that nascent data set. So seeing that be able to grow up and then align itself, whether it's with what Polaris is doing, what Liberty Asia is doing, et cetera, for me as a trafficking data geek is an amazing thing. Because one of the things that trafficking geeks who our prosecutors can do is we can take that and we can go out and put bad guys in jail and help the victims. I'm going to, if it's okay, even though I said you were next, Katie, it was a perfect tee up from An to go over to Polaris, which I've been itching to call in Keely all day, and then we'll come back if that's okay.
So thank you, and thanks for sharing the table. You're all amazing colleagues and activists, and it's just such a wonderful treat to be at the seat with you. So thank you, An, for talking about the CTDC. It's just for reference, it's about 46,000 cases of human trafficking referenced at this moment before the Liberty Asia data. And so it's a standing invitation once we leave beta phase for anyone who has the interest to talk with us about adding their data in, because I think the idea is to what end, right? You stated some very clear care objectives related to that data, and I would also suggest that there's some very clear systemic change objectives with sharing this data. From my point of view, I'm most interested in ensuring that we have a conversation about preventing this crime and disrupting this crime, and following those 2 key points on the continuum in a very real way. And so what I think CTDC can do, in addition to what other data sets can do, is ask about what does a recruitment experience look like? What does an exploitation experience look like? What were the systems that failed you? What were the systems that you accessed when you were in your situation or when you left directly? And with that information, we have the ability to go to sending countries to talk about very specific prevention regimes. We have the ability to go to particular industry sectors and say, this is the thing that failed, which is why 20% of the victims in labor trafficking in that country experienced X. Some core examples, I think, which are just really important as we think through what's the purpose of data, is we've been able, through our own National Human Trafficking Hotline data set, been able to point out that the visa system within the US, which is no surprise to anyone, is a huge driver, actual driver of exploitation in this country, and certainly would be in other countries. But being able to say exactly how it is a driver becomes the compelling point for policymakers when we talk about change. You know, the other question I have with relation to data is, how do we also drive a donor conversation from collecting big data, trying to find the big data, to taking action on the answers it reveals when we find them, right? I think that around this table, we probably all agree that we have enough information, that we have 75% of the solutions we want, right? We know what needs to change, but we don't have, to ILO's point earlier and to others, we don't have any money behind implementation. We don't have a serious look from authorities at what they're going to do next to create change. And so I'm thrilled about the data opportunity, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that that's to drive the what's next. And we need a serious conversation about what does it take to get people to commit to the what's next that the data shows us.
Katie.
Thanks, Lou. And this is a great conversation to be a part of. Thanks to everyone, and thanks especially to Concordia for having us and for working in partnership with us. One of the things about Winrock is that we're working throughout Asia with literally dozens of organizations that are at the front lines of this issue, on the border, in rural communities, trying to address this issue. And I think, one of the really hard realities of a data-related conversation is that a lot of those folks at this point in time are still collecting data on paper, still in very rural areas, still don't have access to the type of telecommunications infrastructure or technology or even the capacity to use it to be able to effectively collect the right types of data using an appropriate technology and have the capacity to accurately capture and use and effectively and safely share the information that they're getting so that it can turn quickly from data into actionable intelligence and actually information that we can use as a community. So, I think some of the areas that I would like to see greater focus on, and certainly that we're focusing on in our programs, are devising strategies for defragmenting some of the data so that it's not so disparate, so that there are more common definitions. At this point in time, Cambodia in the Asia region is still the only country that actually has a standard for victim identification. It's really hard to see how they're going to be able to coordinate with their neighboring countries unless and until everybody else gets on the same page in the region. Not to say that they'll use that definition, but something. So I think there are some real gaps in terms of what exists both at the ground level and at the national systems level to actually turn the information into something that we can use.
Mr. Vance.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on the issue of collaboration, and I don't know what the Attorney General experience is, but I will say that I often feel that collaboration between states and the federal government is not what it should be. And on an issue, whether it's cyber, I feel like I'm talking out loud, but not in a coordinated way. So I want to just say all the businesses here, it's not just you. We can do a much better job, I believe, in working closer with the federal government and with our state partners to share our own information to make us be more effective in our prosecution role as well as in yours. And there's a very smart group, and I sort of hesitate to say something that'll sound too simple, but we were talking about, someone was talking about cell phones and the iPhone starting 10 years ago. We were confronted here in New York City with a series of deaths from construction accidents. And these typically happened on non-union jobs. And the question was, what do we do in order to get at the non-union workers so they can be empowered, as one of the speakers said across the room, they can be empowered even though they are undocumented, often in a vulnerable position. Because ultimately the data that we wanted to see was the pictures of the site, not necessarily the macro data of a jillion red flags. So the most powerful device, so we created a task force, and we've gone out to all the embassies and consulates, which has been a good vehicle to attract those workers into a safe space. But our weapon and our data has been almost most valuable by having them with cell phones take pictures and send it to us by WhatsApp. So it was the cell phone and WhatsApp that ended up being a reliable, simple, and effective way to get to something that is happening right now that can be sent to a place that they hopefully believe is safe. Again, that may be, you guys are dealing with huge volumes, but even with 10 million people who come in here during every day, ultimately, some of the best way to get information is pictures in the hands of folks, and almost everyone has a cell phone, no matter where you come from.
So the fact that everybody has been kind of being cross-sectoral on the last thing as far as collaboration means that we've kind of moved into the collaboration part. So I'm actually going to give ourselves that we've already done at least 10 minutes of that. So we're not that late. But I will actually ask everybody who was thinking and wanting to weigh in on data collection that if you can also talk about how that incentivizes collaboration, then we'll get a twofer out of your interventions. But I very much want to turn the floor over to Anna because IJM is the last organization that has not had a chance to weigh in yet. And Anna, I think you can, you've earned the right to answer any one of our questions today.
Thank you very much. It actually touches on both the question of data as well as the partner, the sort of collaboration efforts. And I think one of the things that we are finding most effective in our collaboration with the corporate world, including with the Walmart Foundation, is the need to fund and look at data that will be actionable. So one of the things that the Walmart Foundation funded over the last 2 years, and I have copies here, is a number of studies into the Thai seafood industry. And the way that we approach it is looking at the prevalence, but also looking at the performance of the justice system and what is the Thai government doing, how are prosecutions proceeding, what happens to cases, a real sort of deep dive. I have a summary here, but there's a deep dive study report on exactly what entities within the government are actioning the laws that exist, as Marcia said, against forced labor, but also how they're being enforced. And so that really is a key for us in terms of collaboration, but also then providing a framework and an in-depth understanding as to what needs to be done. And so our focus really is at IJM is to build the capacity of governments to be able to enforce their laws, particularly on forced labor and child labor issues. So thank you very much. I have copies of the report to share.
Thank you, Anna. And on behalf of Walmart, thank you, Anbin, for the support that the foundation is giving to IJM. If we can actually hold on Duncan and Anbin, because Kate and David, even though their institutions have been heard from, there are folks at the table who we haven't had a chance to hear from yet. So I'm going to jump to them. If we run out of time, again, we'll all talk about it when we're rushing over to the UN for the unveil. David, why don't we go with you?
Sure, thank you, and thanks to Concordia for this conversation and for partnering with us. I actually did want to answer the third question. One of the sub-questions there, which I think is a great one, is how to move industries that are not necessarily consumer-facing. And it's one that, as an organization that in part focuses on the rights of migrant construction workers in the Gulf, we grapple with this issue. I do think, though, that it's important to remember that for every single corporate entity out there, they are part. This is one of the advantages of the interconnectedness now of global supply chains. We often talk about how difficult it is to peer down to tier 4 and tier 5. But one of the advantages is that every single corporate entity is part of a supply chain that at some point is consumer facing. I think with maybe no exception, maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, very few exceptions. And so it becomes incumbent on the retailer or on the consumer facing, and not just incumbent, but it's of course in their interest to push their suppliers to do the right thing. I mean, that just brings me back to something that Anbin said earlier, which I think is a great point, which is this question of cost. And I really think that the other question in this third question is what's next for partnerships? And I think we shouldn't underestimate the value of partnerships between buyers and suppliers, just in one single supply chain. Somebody else over there mentioned, I think Abby, the importance of long-term buyer-supplier relationships, stable buyer-supplier relationships. It's time in a lot of industries, I think, to start talking about cost in concrete terms. And as Anbin mentioned, it may be that the consumer is actually not willing to pay too much more for a particular product. It may be that they are. It may be that in some cases that that being ethical or doing the right thing actually is a good business decision. It may be that for a short-term bottom line, that's not necessarily the case, even though probably in the long term it always is a good decision. But all this is to say that, it's for the retailer, or for at least some entity in that supply chain with leverage, to turn to the buyers and say, are we a big enough client that you can afford to absorb this? Because we as a supply chain have to absorb this. And then you'll consider whether or not you abandon them as a supplier. And then, of course, for you to consider how much you have to, how much that has to eat into your margin, and so on and so forth down the chain. I mean, there has to be a conversation eventually, I think, about costs and how you share those costs. Even though in some sectors we don't know exactly what it will cost to be ethical or to do the right thing on X, Y, or Z issue, we have a pretty good idea, and we know it will cost something. So anyway, that's just an appeal to start talking about cost, and just thanks for your mention about that.
Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Investor, and thanks to Concordia for the discussion and everyone's comments so far. I really wanted to build on what Abby raised earlier. We've spent a lot of time on data, and I know that's a great passion and really significant, but I don't think that we've really spent that much time on the critical role and the advantageous role of frontline voices. And particularly, we haven't really mentioned the role of civil society on the front role, and small organisations and their leaders and people who have the critical keys and the knowledge that give us visibility of fourth, fifth and sixth pieces down the supply chain. That's where we get the knowledge, where we understand that the girl that's being traded into a cotton mill factory, who was the recruiter, who was the blind policeman who just turned away. So I think that's a really critical piece of the puzzle. And the other thing I wanted was a question, given the question that was posed about sort of engaging corporates. And maybe it's an open-ended one, but to the corporates, what more can civil society do to advance what they are doing and how fast that they're moving? What more can we do to accelerate that process?
We could do with our industry folks who are here. I think there's four around the table. If we can do a speed round, we got about 2 minutes that we can do that in. So I'm looking down the row from you, and I think it's on Ben first. So everybody has about 40 seconds to tell Kate and all of us what you need.
Pressure's on. I think in all of this conversation, it's been great. I did want to thank you for the data conversation and the money that you're investing in your organizations to come up with the data. It's not easy, and especially Jen, as we spoke this morning, the surveys are costly, so I applaud your work today, and we're all excited to go to the launch. Very quickly, something to think of outside of the box is with blockchain, it's not initially of interest to our business for the social cost, but for food safety. We need to know, for instance, where our supply chain is, because when there is bacteria or something that comes out, you immediately have to recall. So there's a huge business incentive because recalls are extremely expensive. So I think I raised that point as an example, not looking at this not just from the social issues, but environmental issues. Let's bring in all sorts of data and touch points and business incentives, so that we're driving this from a range of issues, ways in which we're not necessarily immediately apparent, but have implications like food safety and blockchain and supply chain. But as far as the very last question, and I haven't done this in 40 seconds, we welcome your ideas. I love what Kelly said. It's all this data and information and newsletters. We need that, and we need the transparency and understanding. But from the business side, we welcome knowledge on best practices. Okay, when we find this, what do we do? What is, we have a sense and we've built our policies, but that information we welcome so that we will act according to best practice.
Excellent. Chris, what does IBM need? In 40 seconds or less.
Well, I think that the groups and the people, the player, things that are all being done to share the data and to enable it, I think is just outstanding. And I think that we're going to knock down these walls. I've seen it been knocked down at DHS. At a lot of areas we're starting to share. And data, again, is an asset. Develop a good plan to share it, develop a good plan to use it, and go forward and use the intelligence you get from it to stop this problem.
There you go.
I think there are sector-wide problems that are common across various commodities, various goods that are being traded. At the heart of each of the more difficult issues in each sector, there is a policy issue that needs to be tackled. So I'd say that one area where we could all do a better job is identifying the common ground, the common agenda on the advocacy and the policy issue that needs to be tackled, and and getting on with it.
And best for last, Marika?
Wow, okay, pressure's on. 3 quick points. First of all, I think holding up the business sector to account for our performance is important. So the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark surveyed 98 of the world's largest publicly traded companies last year for the first time on human rights, and the average score was 29%. So that's not a powerful demonstration of incredible performance. More needs to be done. We need to step up. So just that positive pressure and holding to account is important, right? Second point would be connecting more at local levels. So, for example, in Mars' work on fish in Thailand, the Isara Institute has been powerful. They're a locally based NGO who has deep connections with vulnerable migrant workers. That's really broken through for us some insights about what we need to be doing. When we look at other supply chains, we have a hard time identifying similar locally based groups with that deep insight and connectedness. So helping us identify those groups would be fantastic. And then third would be showing that this is possible. Sometimes this conversation about forced labor gets it's a bit of a downer because it's just so complicated and so difficult to envision success, a supply chain that's truly well managed and largely free of this issue. So I would also encourage us to show what's possible. So let's try to come back here in a year and have 2, 3, 4 wins that we can talk about. Oh, we did it. We looked end to end at this supply chain, we mapped it out, we used the data, we partnered, and we solved it, right? That would be very encouraging, and I think that would inspire more people to take action.
We are 18 seconds over, so I will simply thank everybody for coming. The tide is turning, and the water is rising on the traffickers, and I think between all of us at this table, and on behalf of the workers and the folks trapped in sex trafficking around the world, we will break these chains. Thanks, everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes